On October 6, 1939, near Koch in eastern Poland, General Franciszek Kleeberg's independent, operational group Policy ended its resistance. His troops had continued, fighting after Warsaw had surrendered, and after Poland had already been divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. They were not destroyed in one final, annihilating charge. They were running out of ammunition. When Kleeberg's force surrendered, the organized campaign that had begun with Germany's invasion on September West was effectively over. Roughly 5 weeks had been enough to dismantle the Polish army as a force operating on Polish soil. One widely used Polish estimate places military losses at nearly 70,000 dead, more than 130,000 wounded, around 300,000 prisoners in German hands, another 250,000 captured by the Soviets, and approximately 83,000 who crossed into neighboring countries. But something unusual had happened. Poland had lost its territory without its government signing a national surrender, and the men who had worn Polish uniforms were about to follow completely different roads. Prison camps in Germany, execution sites in the Soviet Union, secret armies beneath occupied cities, fighter cockpits over Britain, tanks in Normandy, and mountain graves at Monte Cassino. So what actually happened to Poland's soldiers after their country fell? To understand why their fate became so complicated, it is important to understand what the army represented before 1939. The Polish state itself was only 21 years old. Poland had returned to the map of Europe in 1918 after more than a century, during which its territory had been partitioned among the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires. Its armed forces were therefore more than another government institution. For many Poles, the army was inseparable from the recovery of sovereignty itself. Its senior officers included veterans of the First World War, Józef Piłsudski's Polish legions, independence organizations, and the wars that followed Poland's rebirth. The Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1920 had reinforced a military culture built around the idea that independence was something that might have to be defended simultaneously against powerful neighbors. By the late 1930s, Poland maintained a large conscript army and could mobilize roughly 1 million men, although mobilization was incomplete when Germany attacked. Polish forces possessed artillery, armored vehicles, aircraft, cavalry brigades, and a professional officer corps, the familiar image of Polish cavalrymen hopelessly charging. German tanks is a distortion of how the army actually fought. Mounted formations normally used horses for mobility and fought dismounted with modern infantry, weapons, and anti-tank guns. But Poland faced a structural problem no courage could remove. Germany's military resources were much greater. German forces attacking Poland included well over 1 million troops, thousands of armored vehicles, and a powerful air force. Their operations combined armor, motorized formations, artillery, and aviation at a tempo that repeatedly disrupted Polish attempts to establish stable defensive lines. And Poland's geography made the danger worse. The country had long borders, strategically exposed industrial areas, and enemies potentially positioned on more than one side. Its planners hoped to preserve enough of the army to continue resistance, while Britain and France attacked Germany in the west. That assumption was fundamental, because Poland's strategy was never based on defeating Germany alone. It was based on surviving long enough for the war to become a coalition war. The coalition war did begin, just not quickly enough to save Poland. By 1939, Adolf Hitler had already overturned much of the European settlement created after the First World War. Germany had rearmed, remilitarized the Rhineland, absorbed Austria, dismantled Czechoslovakia, and increasingly demanded changes to the status of Danzig and the Polish corridor. Polish leaders faced a dangerous calculation. Accepting German demands risked reducing Poland to dependency. Refusing them meant confronting a military power considerably stronger than Poland itself. Britain and France gave Poland guarantees in the spring of 1939. Those commitments mattered politically. When Germany invaded, both governments declared war on September 3. Hitler had failed to keep the conflict localized, but declarations of war did not immediately translate into a Western offensive, powerful enough to relieve the Polish army. Then on August 23, 1939, the strategic situation became catastrophic. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression agreement. Secretly, the two powers divided divided parts of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and contemplated the partition of Poland. Hitler could now attack without expecting Soviet military intervention against Germany. Stalin, meanwhile, gained the opportunity to expand westward after Germany had already absorbed much of the Polish army's attention. Germany invaded on September 1st. Polish mobilization had not been completed. German forces attacked from several directions, including East Prussia, in the north and German-controlled territory to the west and southwest. Air attacks disrupted transportation and communications while armored. Spearheads penetrated defensive positions and threatened encirclement. The Polish army fought hard, and the campaign was not the effortless. German victory later propaganda sometimes suggested. Major battles developed along the Bzura River, around Warsaw on the coast, and across southeastern Poland. But the operational problem kept becoming worse. Units retreating from one German thrust often discovered another force appearing behind them. Railways were damaged. Headquarters lost communications with subordinate formations. Civilian refugees crowded the same roads armies needed for movement. Polish commanders increasingly looked towards southeastern Poland. The intention was to establish a defensive region near the Romanian frontier, maintain communication with friendly Romania, and continue fighting while awaiting stronger Allied action in the west. Then, before that strategy could be fully realized, a second army crossed Poland's frontier. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. The Soviet government claimed that the Polish state had collapsed. Polish authorities rejected that argument, but the military reality was devastating. Poland now faced two great powers from opposite directions. The government and military high command moved toward Romania, while Polish units received instructions that generally emphasized avoiding major combat with Soviet troops unless attacked and attempting to reach Hungary or Romania where possible. The decision saved part of the army. It also scattered it. Men who had begun September serving in the same armed forces were now moving toward completely different futures. Some continued fighting the Germans. Some fought Soviet formations. Some crossed borders and were interned. Some were surrounded and captured. Others simply took off their uniforms and went home. That could look like the end of their military lives. For thousands, it was actually the beginning of a new kind of war. Warsaw remained the most powerful symbol of Polish resistance. German forces had reached the capital early in the campaign, but the city did not simply open its gates. Polish troops and civilians organized defenses, while German artillery and aircraft subjected Warsaw to increasingly severe bombardment. By late September, the military and humanitarian situation had become untenable. Warsaw capitulated on September 28th. German troops entered the city, and under agreements between Berlin and Moscow, Germany and the Soviet Union formalized their partition of Polish territory. Yet fighting continued elsewhere. On the Baltic coast, isolated Polish positions resisted. In the east and southeast, formations attempted to break through enemy forces or reach neutral borders. Kleberg's Operational Group Polesi, assembled from units that had not originally been intended to fight together as one field army, remained active even after the capital fell. Near Koch, beginning on October 2nd, Kleberg's troops fought German forces for several days. By October 6th, ammunition was nearly exhausted. The group surrendered. The conventional campaign was finished. What followed was not a single surrender ceremony covering the Polish armed forces. There was no Polish equivalent of the national armistice France would sign with. Germany in June 1940, President Ignacy Mościcki, interned after crossing into Romania, transferred his constitutional authority. Władysław Raczkiewicz became president, and General Władysław Sikorski emerged as prime minister and commander-in-chief of a government in exile that would first establish itself in France and later in Britain. That legal continuity had enormous consequences. A Polish private captured near Warsaw might now be a German prisoner. A Polish officer seized in the east might be transported into the Soviet Union. A pilot who crossed into Romania might eventually reach France. A sailor who had escaped the Baltic could continue operating beside the Royal Navy. And inside occupied Poland, men who appeared to have become Civilians began constructing clandestine command structures claiming loyalty to the same Polish Republic, whose regular formations had just been defeated. The army therefore did not survive as one organization. It fragmented into several military worlds. The first was captivity, and for those captured by the Soviet Union, captivity contained a danger that many families would not understand for years. The scale of the separation was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Polish servicemen entered German custody. Prisoners were processed through temporary collection points and then distributed through the German POW system. Polish officers could spend years in OFLAG camps, while enlisted prisoners passed through stalags and labor detachments. Surviving records from camps such as Woldenberg, Sandbostel, and others document Polish prisoners arriving immediately after the 1939 campaign. For an officer, this might mean exchanging command of a regiment for years behind wire. For his family, the consequences extended beyond the camp. The Germans had not merely occupied Western and Central Poland. Nazi policy sought to restructure Polish society through executions, deportations, forced labor, cultural suppression, and the destruction of political and intellectual leadership. Polish military families therefore faced not only the absence of husbands and fathers, but an occupation that regarded much of the country's independent institutional life as something to be dismantled. East of the new German-Soviet boundary, the situation developed differently. The Red Army captured large numbers of Polish servicemen, police officers, border guards, and other uniformed personnel. Soviet security authorities separated important categories of prisoners, especially officers and state officials. Among them was Brigadier General Władysław Anders. Wounded during the September fighting, Anders was captured by Soviet forces. His immediate future was not another battlefield, but Soviet imprisonment. Thousands of other officers disappeared into camps at Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. Their families received letters, then the letters stopped. In March 1940, the Soviet Politburo authorized a mass killing operation. During the following weeks, the NKVD murdered nearly 22,000 Polish citizens in the Katyn operation, including roughly 4,500 POWs from the principal special camps and thousands of prisoners held elsewhere. Many victims were reserve officers who in civilian life had been doctors, teachers, engineers, lawyers, academics, officials, and other professionals. The murder, therefore, struck two institutions at once. It destroyed part of Poland's officer corps, and it destroyed part of Poland's educated civilian elite. Other Polish citizens under Soviet rule were arrested, deported, or transported deep into the USSR. Precise totals remain debated because different studies count different deportation categories and periods, but the repression affected hundreds of thousands of people. Families could be moved to Siberia, Kazakhstan, or other distant regions with little preparation. Yet there was a third category of soldier whose September journey ended neither behind German wire nor inside the Soviet prison system. Approximately 83,000 Polish troops reached neighboring neutral countries, particularly Romania and Hungary. Under international law and political pressure, many were formally interned. But internment was not necessarily the end of their journey. Polish diplomatic and military networks, sometimes with sympathetic local assistance, helped large numbers leave the Balkans and travel onward through Yugoslavia, Italy, the Mediterranean, or other routes toward France. A Polish wartime mission later estimated that about 21,000 military personnel were evacuated from Romania to France. Alone during 1939 and 1940, some men escaped camps quietly. Some obtained documents. Others traveled across several borders before putting on a Polish uniform again. And while they moved west, another army was being created at home. On September 27th, even before Warsaw formally surrendered, underground military organization had begun. Structures evolved through the Service for Poland's Victory and the Union of Armed Struggle into what would eventually become the Home Army, the Armia Krajowa. Its members faced a completely different military existence. There were no public barracks. Weapons were hidden. Orders were carried by courier. Officers used false names. Training, intelligence, sabotage, propaganda, and eventually partisan warfare took place beneath an occupation in which discovery could mean torture, execution, or retaliation against civilians. The defeat of September had therefore produced a paradox. Poland had lost control of every major city and virtually all of its territory. But Polish soldiers were already rebuilding armed forces both outside the country and beneath it. The men who escaped west. France became the first great gathering turning point. Under General Sikorski, Polish forces were reconstructed from soldiers who had escaped through Romania and Hungary, personnel already living abroad, and volunteers from Polish communities outside the country. By 1940, the Polish army in France had grown into a force numbering tens of thousands. Polish formations fought in Norway at Narvik and against the German invasion of France itself. When France collapsed in June 1940, the Poles experienced something brutally familiar, a second Allied country disappearing around them. Again, they evacuated. Around 20,000 Polish soldiers reached Britain from France, while other formations followed different paths. The repeated evacuations altered the meaning of survival. A soldier could begin the war defending Poland, escape through Hungary, rebuild his unit in France, lose France, cross the English Channel, and still be fighting less than a year after. His original army had supposedly ceased to exist. The Polish Air Force followed a similar route. Pilots and ground crews had fought in September, evacuated through southeastern Europe and reassembled first in France and then Britain. Polish airmen went on to make a major contribution during the Battle of Britain. The Imperial War Museums record Polish fighter pilots as responsible for a significant share of confirmed German aircraft losses during the battle. This mattered beyond the statistics. The German invasion had not destroyed Polish military experience. It had exported it. Men trained before 1939 were now using that experience inside Allied forces, the soldiers who went south. Not every escape route led to Britain. Polish personnel who moved through the Balkans and Middle East helped form the independent Carpathian Rifle Brigade. In 1941, it fought alongside British forces during the siege of Tobruk and later operations in North Africa. Here was another transformation. Men from a country on the Baltic were now fighting in the Libyan desert because the shortest path back to Poland had become a war-spanning continent. But the largest Polish military force to emerge from the east required an even stranger reversal. It began inside Stalin's prisons, enders from Soviet prisoner to Polish commander. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Moscow's relationship with the Polish government in exile changed almost overnight. Stalin now needed allies against Hitler. The Sikorski-Mayski agreement restored diplomatic relations between the Polish and Soviet governments and made possible the formation of a Polish army on Soviet territory. Władysław Anders was released from Soviet imprisonment and chosen to command it. Suddenly, Polish citizens who had been prisoners, deportees and labor camp inmates began traveling enormous distances toward recruiting centers. They arrived hungry, sick, poorly equipped, and often searching for missing relatives. One question quickly became impossible to avoid. Where were the thousands of Polish officers who had disappeared from the Soviet camps? Polish authorities repeatedly asked. The Soviet government did not provide a truthful answer. Many of those missing men were already dead in the Katyn killing sites. Tension between Anders' command and Soviet authorities grew over food, equipment, recruitment, citizenship, and strategy. Eventually, the Polish force was evacuated through Iran in 1942. The evacuation also carried civilians. More than 110,000 Polish citizens ultimately reached Iran during the major evacuation movements, transforming Persian ports and camps into one stage of a vast Polish wartime migration. The soldiers moved onward through Iraq and Palestine. They eventually formed the core of the Polish II Corps. And in 1944, the road that had begun in Soviet prisons reached the mountains of Italy. At Monte Cassino, Allied armies had repeatedly struggled against German defenses blocking the route toward Rome. In May, Anders' corps entered the battle. The fighting was severe. On May 18th, Polish troops occupied the ruined monastery position after German forces withdrew from their immediate defenses during the wider Allied breakthrough. Polish casualties were heavy, and Monte Cassino became one of the central symbols of the Polish war in exile. The symbolism was almost impossible to miss. Some of the soldiers climbing those slopes had been arrested by the Soviet regime in 1939 and 1940. Now they were dying in Italy to defeat Germany, and they still did not know whether victory would allow them to go home. The army beneath Poland. For soldiers who remained inside occupied Poland, survival required a different transformation. The underground military expanded into the home army, loyal to the government in exile. It operated inside the broader Polish underground state, which developed clandestine administrative, educational, judicial, intelligence, and political institutions operations beneath German occupation. Home Army personnel sabotaged transport, gathered intelligence, printed underground publications, executed certain collaborators and German officials, protected communications with London, and prepared for a national uprising. Some of its officers had worn regular Polish uniforms in September 1939. Now the same men might travel under forged papers carrying a pistol beneath. Civilian clothing. Witold Pilecki represents how extreme this path could become. Pilecki fought during the September campaign. He later joined the underground and in 1940 deliberately allowed himself to be arrested during a German roundup so that he could enter Auschwitz, gather information, and organize resistance inside the camp. He escaped in 1943. Then he fought again during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. The uprising was the largest military gamble made by the underground. On August 1st, 1944, with Soviet forces approaching Warsaw, the Home Army began an open revolt intended to liberate the capital from German control and assert Polish sovereignty before Soviet political power could be imposed. For 63 days, the insurgents fought. The Germans crushed the uprising. Warsaw was devastated, and surviving Home Army combatants who surrendered were eventually granted prisoner of war treatment under the capitulation terms. But Germany was no longer the only danger to the underground. As Soviet armies entered Polish territory, Home Army units attempted in many places to cooperate tactically. Against the Germans under Operation Tempest, the political goals of the two sides were fundamentally incompatible. The Home Army recognized the London government. Stalin was constructing an alternative Polish political order dependent on Moscow. Soviet security forces therefore disarmed, arrested, and in some cases deported members of the non-communist resistance. The soldiers who had hidden from the Gestapo now had to decide whether to reveal themselves to the NKVD. That decision could determine whether they returned to civilian life or entered another prison. The Poles who fought west from Normandy. Meanwhile, Polish troops in Britain had been preparing for the return to continental Europe. General Stanisław Maczek, another veteran of the 1939 campaign, eventually commanded the 1st Polish Armored Division. After the Normandy landings, Maczek's division fought through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. It played an important role around the Falaise pocket, helped liberate communities including Breda, crossed into Germany, and ended the war at Wilhelmshaven. Again, the chronology produced a strange result. A Polish commander driven out of Poland in 1939 had helped liberate parts of Western Europe in 1944 and 1945, but his own country was becoming politically inaccessible to him. Maczek ultimately remained in Scotland for decades. In September 1946, Poland's communist authorities stripped a group of prominent officers abroad, including Henderson Maczek of Polish citizenship. Military victory had not led them back to the state from which they had marched in 1939. The soldiers who returned with the Red Army. There was another Polish army moving westward at the same time. After Anders' force left the Soviet Union, Soviet authorities sponsored new Polish military formations under communist political supervision, beginning with the 1st Tadeusz Kościuszko Infantry Division. These forces expanded substantially as the Red Army advanced. They fought the Germans on the Eastern Front and eventually entered Polish territory and Germany with Soviet armies. Their soldiers had diverse backgrounds. Some were Polish citizens who had remained in the USSR after the Anders evacuation. Others were conscripted as Soviet forces moved west. For many ordinary soldiers, joining provided food, a uniform, a route out of displacement, and an opportunity to fight Germany. This meant that by 1944 and 1945, Polish soldiers were advancing against the same enemy under two competing political systems. One Polish army answered ultimately to authorities in London. Another was tied to a political structure being built under Soviet protection. Inside Poland, the Home Army was trying to preserve the authority of the first while encountering the growing power of the second. Germany's defeat would settle the military war. It would not settle which Poland had won. After victory, go home or stay away. In February 1945, the Yalta Agreements made clear that post-war Poland would fall. With within the Soviet sphere of power, and that its eastern border would shift dramatically westward. For soldiers whose homes were in cities such as Lwów or Wilno, the problem was especially profound. Their hometown might no longer be located inside Poland at all. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, approximately 6 years after the September campaign, Polish troops stood among the victors in Italy, Western Europe, Britain, and the Soviet-led forces in Germany. But the government they had followed from Warsaw to France to London was losing international recognition. On July 5, 1945, the United States recognized the Soviet-backed Polish Provisional Government of National Unity and ended official relations with the Polish government in exile. Britain similarly transferred recognition. For the soldiers abroad, the choice became intensely personal: return to Poland and accept the new political reality, or remain outside the country they had spent 6 years trying to liberate. Władysław Anders chose exile. Witold Pilecki chose something far more dangerous. After the Warsaw Uprising, German captivity, and eventual service with Anders' II Corps in Italy, Pilecki returned clandestinely to communist-controlled Poland to conduct intelligence work for the independence movement. He was arrested in 1947. After interrogation and a political trial, he was executed in Warsaw on May 25, 1948. His burial place was concealed. A soldier who had survived the defeat of 1939, volunteered for Auschwitz, escaped, fought in Warsaw, and survived German captivity, was ultimately killed not by Nazi Germany, but by the government-ruling post-war Poland. For Poland's surviving pre-war soldiers, there could hardly be a clearer demonstration that the aftermath of September 1939 had not ended in May 1945. The Home Army was formally dissolved on January 19, 1945. Its final commander, Leopold Okulicki, hoped dissolution might protect soldiers from Soviet repression and allow them to return to ordinary life. For many, it did not. Some underground fighters continued armed resistance against the new communist authorities. Others tried to disappear into civilian society. Veterans of the Home Army could face surveillance, interrogation, imprisonment, employment discrimination, or political prosecution. The extent and intensity varied across time and individual circumstances. But service in organizations loyal to the London government could become a liability rather than an honor in Stalinist Poland. Those who remained in the West faced a different kind of disappearance. Their armies had to be demobilized. Britain created the Polish Resettlement Corps in 1946 to help former Polish servicemen transition into civilian employment. The Polish Resettlement Act followed in 1947, enabling more than 200,000 Poles, including servicemen and dependents, to build lives in Britain. The Corps itself was dissolved in 1949. Men who had commanded tanks became factory workers. Pilots entered civilian trades. Former officers opened businesses, studied, drove trucks, worked on farms, and raised children who spoke English beside Polish. Veterans established churches, clubs, schools, welfare organizations, archives, and commemorative associations. Regimental traditions survived without territory. Britain was only one destination. Polish wartime displacement produced communities across Canada, Australia, the United States, Argentina, and elsewhere. Other veterans returned to Poland despite the political risks. Some adapted to the new system. Some remained privately loyal to the traditions of the pre-war republic. Others served in the post-war Polish armed forces. And this is where the mythology surrounding 1939 becomes misleading. Poland unquestionably suffered a devastating military defeat. Its territory was conquered. Its army lost enormous numbers of dead, wounded, captured, and missing. But the claim that the Polish military simply vanished after a few weeks confuses destruction of a campaign with destruction of an institution. Within months, Polish troops were fighting from Norway to France. Within a year, Polish pilots were fighting over Britain. Others defended Tobruk. Former Soviet prisoners fought through Italy. Maciek's armored soldiers returned to continental Europe from the west. Soviet-sponsored Polish armies advanced from the east. And inside Poland, one of occupied Europe's largest underground military organizations operated for years beneath German rule. The Polish military tradition survived because its soldiers adapted faster than the political identical. Map around them, uniforms changed, command relationships changed, allied governments changed, borders changed, even the internationally recognized government of Poland changed. But the continuity between the soldiers of September 1939 and the Polish formations of 1940 through 1945 is unmistakable. The deeper tragedy is that the war they believed they were fighting and the war that actually ended were not quite the same. In 1939, many marched to preserve an independent Polish republic. In 1945, Germany had been defeated and Poland had returned to the map. But it returned with altered borders, a government increasingly controlled by communists backed by the Soviet Union, and tens of thousands of veterans wondering whether the country called Poland was still politically the homeland they had left. The military defeat lasted 5 weeks. Its consequences shaped lives for decades. So what happened to Poland's soldiers after their country fell in 1939? They were scattered, not erased. Some spent the war behind German wire. Thousands of Polish officers and other prisoners were murdered by the Soviets. Tens of thousands escaped across Europe and rebuilt Polish armies abroad. Others disappeared into the underground and fought inside their occupied homeland. Still others eventually returned westward with Soviet-backed Polish forces. And when Germany finally surrendered, another division appeared. Some veterans went home. Some continued resisting communism. Some were imprisoned or executed. And many accepted that exile, originally expected to last months, had become permanent. That is the real aftermath of Poland's defeat. The Polish army lost its battlefield and then spent 6 years fighting from almost everywhere except Poland itself. But perhaps the hardest question came after the shooting ended. If the country you fought for returns with different borders and a different political system, what does going home actually mean? Tell me how you would have answered that choice. And if you want more stories about what happened to soldiers after their old world disappeared, subscribe to After the Sword.